All right, I think we can get going. I'd like to welcome you to the last lecture of the annual lecture series organized by the Center for Philosophy of Science in 2020-2021. Before introducing the event, as well as our speaker, let me remind you of the remaining events at the center as the semester closes its end. We have two talks left on Tuesday next week. Mike Schneider, who is a postdoc at the center, will be giving a talk about empty space and the positive cosmological constant. And a week from now, on Tuesday, April 20th, Karim Khalifa will be talking about retooling the epistemology of measurement. And then that's going to be the end of the semester, and we will see you next fall. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce the 2021 Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecture. But before introducing our speaker, let me remind you of the Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecture. This memorial lecture was created 2 years ago thanks to a very generous gift of Barbara Grünbaum, the daughter of Adolf Grünbaum, and her family, following the passing of Adolf Grünbaum, 1923-2018. Adolf barely needs any introduction, as I'm sure all of you are very familiar with his contribution to not only the philosophy of science, but also the history of the University of Pittsburgh. But let me just remind you, Grünbaum was born, as I said, in 1923 in Germany. He left Germany in 1938, worked for the US Army before getting an MS in physics and a PhD in philosophy in 1951 from Yale University. From there, he moved to Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, when Pete got the incredible idea to hire Grünbaum, and that changed the history of philosophy at Pitt. Grünbaum was the first Andrew Mellon Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, and he was the Andrew Mellon Professor of Philosophy from 1960 to his death in 2018. He also had many other positions at Pitt. He was a research professor of psychiatry, and he a primary research professor in HPS from the Department of History and Philosophy of Science from 2006. He was instrumental. He was a creator of the Center for Philosophy of Science. He created the center in 1960, and he was the director of the center until 1978, and then became the first chairman of the center. And he remained the chairman until his death. His contribution to philosophy of science is unparalleled, and I think it's not an exaggeration to say that Grünbaum was one of the giants in the philosophy of science and philosophy of physics in the second half of the 20th century. He made groundbreaking contribution to our understanding of space and time, and later on to the foundations of psychoanalysis. He probably wrote the most important work by a stretch on psychoanalysis. He was, as many of my colleagues could attest, he was a wonderful and very impressive mind, and a force to be reckoned with in philosophical discussion. And we are still missing his presence at the center. Today, and for the last 2 years, then we've had this Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecture, which happens once a year. It's a second event this year in 2021. The first Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecturer was Michael Strevens last year, and the second Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecturer is Michela Massimi, who has joined us from Edinburgh, and we are extremely happy to have Michela with us today. Michela is a philosopher of science, philosopher of physics, historian of philosopher. She's a professor in the School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. She has published widely on a range of topics in the philosophy of physics. She published a book on Pauli's exclusion principle a few years ago, on Kant. She has a volume on Kant. And she is, at least so her CV says, finishing or has finished a book on Perspectival realism. Is it out already or is it about to be out?
It will be out in the autumn, so I'm about to submit, literally.
We are all looking. We are actually all looking forward from that book. Michela has published extremely a very large number of very influential papers on Kant, in the philosophy of physics, on measurement, but also she's one of the leading philosophers working on scientific perspectivalism. So we're really looking forward to her thoughts on the matter. She was a co-editor of the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science. Thanks for that. It's a huge amount of work. She was also the vice president of the European Philosophy of Science Association. She is currently the president-elect of the Philosophy of Science Association, and she will be the president in 2023. 2024. Thanks for that also. I know it's a huge amount of work, so I'm actually very grateful that you are doing it, and I feel the association is in good hands with you. She's part of many association and prestigious things, the Royal Astronomical Society, the Royal Science of Edinburgh, and others. So she's an extremely accomplished, that's going to be a euphemism, philosopher of science. And I'm really extremely delighted that you accepted our invitation to be the 2021 Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecture. I think that's hard to find anyone who would be better than you for that lecture. So thanks for joining us, and I wish we could host you here in Pittsburgh, but that's better. That's wonderful to have you nonetheless. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Edward, for the really extremely kind and generous introduction, and thank you so much to you and to the whole committee for this kind invitation. I'll share my screen, so I have PowerPoint. So let me see whether it works. Can you see the PowerPoint?
It is working.
Okay, lovely. So thank you really very, very much for this very kind invitation. I'm truly honored to be giving this 2021 Adolf Grünbaum annual Memorial Lecture, and I was very fortunate to spend a semester in Pittsburgh back in 2009, and I think on that occasion I still vividly remember meeting Grünbaum. I will come to seminars and events organized by the Center for Philosophy of Science. But before then, effectively, my first encounter with the Grünbaum work, it goes back to my graduate time at LSE, where his articles on philosophy of space-time and the directionality of time, but also on theoretical virtues in science, among others, were really a classic on which myself and really generations of philosophers of science and philosophers of physics were trained. So I'm really delighted to be able to give my little contribution today on behalf of my generation in remembering Adolf Grünbaum's seminal work in the field. Now, I don't work myself in the philosophy of space-time, so today's talk will take a different direction, which, however, I still believe is compatible with and indeed congenial to the kind of epistemic methodological tenets of Adolf Grünbaum's view. He was greatly inspired by logical empiricism, and especially by Hans Reichenbach, from whom he developed his anti-foundationalist arguments for the spatiotemporal manifold. And in a way, today I'm going to offer a similar argument for natural kinds. So I too shall take my starting point with the logical empiricist tradition, and in particular Otto Neurath, famous anti-foundationalist view. And this will be the entry point for an anti-foundationalist and anti-essentialist take on natural kind. And this is part of my the kind of philosophical view on perspectival realism that, as Eduard was mentioning, I'm presenting in this monograph that will hopefully be coming out in the autumn. As I said, I'm very, very close to submitting at this point. And it's something that really I developed over several chapters in the monograph. So in today's lecture, I will only really give a bird's eye view and skip over many details of the argument, but I hope that at least it will make clear how my Neurath-inspired approach to natural kinds chimes in a way with Grünbaum, Reichenbach-inspired account of space-time geometry. The lecture is structured into 3 parts. So in part 1, I kind of go over some of the state of the art in the literature on natural kinds and identify 4 main functions that natural kinds have been associated with and corresponding varieties of philosophical views. In part 2, I motivate the rationale for the Neurathian approach to natural kinds. And in part 3, I illustrate the approach with a couple of examples from developmental psychology and botany. And finally, again, on a personal autobiographical note, my interest in the topic of natural kinds originate actually from a graduate seminar I ran at Pittsburgh back in 2009 on this topic. And I had the fortune and privilege of having among the graduate students attending the seminar some of the people that I think are actually there today in the audience, people like Julia Burston, for example, Eli Sheck, among others. And some of them, in particular Julia, for example, has since gone on to develop really interesting views on natural kinds in nanotechnology. So in more than one way, this lecture is really my way of saying thank you to the Center for Philosophy of Science that Adolf Grünbaum established, and also to the HPS department that fostered some of my really early interest in this topic. So let's get started with part 1. What are natural kinds for? Now, realism about science begins with only consideration, the idea that there is an external world which is independent of us human beings, and that this world comes pre-packaged with natural kinds, water, gold, hydrogen, but also lemon and zebras and hellebores, among many other examples. Natural kinds are said in the Platonic lingo to carve nature at its joints. They mirror natural divisions that don't depend on the whims of our language or the evolution of our concepts. But what is a natural kind? Defining kind membership by a list of sufficient and necessary properties has proved fraught with difficulties. So granted a rough and ready definition of mammals as a lactating animal with a fur and not laying egg, the discovery in New South Wales of the platypus in the 18th century unsurprisingly caused havoc among the British zoologists. The platypus has a fur and mammary glands, but lays egg. Does it still count as a mammal? How about isotopic varieties of water? Will it still count as water despite very different chemical properties? On the face of it, the isotopic variety deuterium oxide is toxic to all forms of life and is used in the production of the hydrogen bomb, as Joseph Laporte in his 2004 book describes it. And without obviously mentioning the reclassification of Pluto as a known planet, or the wildly contingent nature of higher taxa in biology, where gulls and terns form subfamilies and kingbird and cuckoo correspond to genera, as John Dupre originally pointed out. So where to go from here? Despite these formidable challenges, I think natural kinds continue to fascinate philosophers and remain an important watershed for realist and anti-realist commitments about science. Now, without giving any complete or exhaustive list, here are some of the reasons why. Natural kinds have traditionally been regarded as delivering on 4 main functions in science, what I'm going to be calling naturalism, unanimity, projectibility, and homological resilience. And let me briefly review each of them. Naturalism begins really with the intuition behind the Platonic lingo carving nature at its joints that there are functionally relevant groupings in nature, to echo Quine's 1969 paper. Now, Quine believed that kinds in a way are part of our animal birthright, as he says, our subjective survival adaptive ability to space qualities into classes and groupings that prove to be functionally relevant over time. But natural kinds are also meant to fulfill another important function. Zoologists might disagree about specific morphological features of a platypus, as much as oceanographists might disagree about the percentage of deuterium oxide in the Pacific Ocean, and astronomers might debate whether Pluto is indeed a planet. But as long as platypus, water, and planet form natural kinds, each in their own right, there is something that everyone can agree on. Natural kinds are not just meant to mark natural divisions in nature, they're also designed to identify features common to a class of entity upon which scientific agreement can be reached. The search for unanimity is what in part originally motivated the Kripke-Putnam account of natural kinds. So natural kinds defined by a set of essential macrostructural properties offer a common platform for unanimous judgment, removed of all the historical accident and contingencies of how any particular epistemic community might or might not have come to know that water is H2O or gold is element with atomic number 79. And the theory of natural kinds also has to make sense of the success, obviously, of our inductive inferences and explanation. So projectable natural kinds avert the risk of Goodman-Gruss scenario. And to deliver on projectability, for example, Richard Boyd proposed the homostatic property cluster kind account, and other philosophers of biology have explained projectability by appealing to the notion of homologues, traits of features, sometimes morphological or genetic, observed across different species that are traceable to phylogenetic continuity with a common ancestor. And finally, there is yet another feature of natural kinds that is related to projectability. Natural kinds support laws of nature, a feature that I'd like to call nomological resilience. After all, what is the ability of a natural kinds to license successful inferences and explanation, if not the expression of their ability to support the laws of nature? Knowing that the electron is a natural kind, for example, makes it possible to explain phenomena such as electrostatic discharge or electromagnetic induction that follow specific laws of nature. And the kind that comes hand in hand with laws of nature have been famously pointed out by other philosophical views, famously by Ian Hacking and his discussion of how milk kinds became purse kind. So this is just to give an overview of and it's a very obviously incomplete overview of where the debate on natural kinds has gone over the past decades, and some of the main functions the natural kinds have been identified with, and the kind of philosophical views that those functions have been associated with. And obviously, depending on which of these form and functions gets privilege, different philosophical views have emerged. So for example, naturalism, I think, is a common feature shared by a number of philosophical views, but it's primarily congenial to a somewhat deflationary account a la Quine, whereas unanimity invites metaphysically more substantial accounts that identify natural kinds with sets of essential macrostructural properties via powerful semantic or epistemic arguments. Projectability underpins a number of realist accounts. I mentioned Boyd, homostatic property cluster account. They have a kind of a less pronounced metaphysical slant and more attention to historical lineages. And homological resilience in turn is compatible with pragmatist and nominalist view, where the emphasis is on agents, as homo faber, as Hacking calls it. So in what follow, I want to very briefly motivate a view of natural kinds that is meant to address some of the problems affecting these four broad families of philosophical views on kind. And ultimately today, I don't really have the time to present my account in full details. As I said, it covers at the moment several chapters in the book I'm about to submit. So I just want to give the gist of the account, which is metaphysically deflationary, like Quine. It does not subscribe to the Putnam-Kripke essentialist story or to Boyd homostatic property cluster account, but doesn't endorse nominalism either. So my account is somehow Neurathian in its anti-foundationalist and anti-essentialist take on natural kinds. So moving to part 2 on the Neurathian view of natural kinds. So first of all, let me be clear that by Neurathian view, I don't mean a view of natural kinds that Neurath himself defended or discussed, as far as I know of, but instead I mean a view of natural kinds that is loosely inspired by the famous metaphor of Neurath both, namely a view of natural kinds that is intentionally without any solid metaphysical foundation, and yet not open to relativistic or conventionalist take. So if anything, it will be better labeled as a kind of perspectival realist view of natural kinds. Neurath's anti-foundationalist program in philosophy was really designed as a reaction against both the presumption of first foundation and also against what he called unbridled relativism. Obviously, the metaphor was picked up by Quine himself. So again, we go back to Quine as an emblem of naturalism in epistemology. And the key question for him became the following: why should our subjective spacing of quality have a special purchase of nature and alien on the future? And this is how he answered that question. He said, well, I see philosophy and science as in the same boat, a boat which, to revert to Neurath figure, as I so often do, we can rebuild only at sea while staying afloat in it. There is no external vantage point, there is no first philosophy. For me, then, the problem of induction is a problem about the world, a problem of how we, as we now are, by our present scientific lights, in a world we never made, should stand better than random or coin-tossing chances of coming out right when we predict by induction, which are based on our innate, scientifically unjustified similarity standards. Darwin natural selection is a plausible partial explanation. Now, natural selection might indeed be a plausible partial explanation, and yet, in thinking about where the natural divisions lie, even a modest version of Quinean naturalism these days, I think, has to take into account the bewildering number of cases of natural kinds that synthetic biology, nanotechnology, cheminformatics, among many others, are gradually uncovering. So the boundaries between the natural and the engineered are more blurred and fuzzier than one might suppose. And I think any philosophical account of natural kinds that intend to fulfill naturalism today has to be flexible enough to make room for engineered kind, such as synthetic yeast or nanomaterials or biosignature in astrobiology, that to all intents and purposes are as natural as their old cousin. So I'm gonna very quickly, and as I said, I'm not going to give any argument here because I'm kind of squeezing chapters into a paper. I'm going to give just 3 lessons out of this simple kind of gesturing at a plurality of scientific practices. So my first lesson here is that the naturalness of natural kinds is not just the product of our subjective spacing of quality, to echo Quine, but it's also the result of our perspectival scientific history, where synthetic biology, astrobiology, among many other disciplines, are on a journey to extend and redefine the very boundaries of what counts as a natural kind. When it comes to unanimity, the history of science, in turn, I think, has posed really formidable challenges to any realist and even more so essentialist, really, account of natural kinds. So there's a lovely paper by Kuhn in 1990 that, in my view, presents one of the most lucid historical arguments against the Kripke-Putnam view of natural kinds. For there, he argued that Pache-Putnam twin Earth experiment, a hypothetical doppelganger Oscar living in the year 7050 before Lavoisier's discovery of oxygen, would not have been referring to water all along, as we do today. Water, for an 18th century pre-Cavendish, pre-Lavoisier natural philosopher, was an elementary liquid substance, with liquidity being an essential properties of water. And it's only after Lavoisier chemical revolution that the distinction between solids, liquids, and gases became physical rather than chemical. So the vulnerability of rigid designators, to use the title of Kuhn's paper, affects natural kinds that, albeit resilient in our scientific history, like water, have in fact evolved across time, gone through measured scientific revolution and conceptual changes. Natural kinds have a history of their own. They evolve to survive and adapt to constantly changing and shifting scientific landscape. So this is my lesson number 2, that the epistemic unanimity granted by natural kinds is not a byproduct of a metaphysics of essential property from nowhere. It is itself the product of our perspectival scientific history and of the kind of claim that we have retained across conceptual change. And obviously, when it comes to projectability, again, as I said, I associate the account primarily with realist view like Boyd on the study property cluster kind. But even those accounts tend to ride roughshod over a curious and sometimes neglected fact, namely that discarded kinds were often projectable. Now, how can kinds whose membership is an empty set, like caloric, support nonetheless inductive inferences and explanation relevant areas of inquiry? These kinds were imagined, they were supposed to exist, to have properties, to behave in specific ways. Models of them were built and used to gain important information about different phenomena in nature. Lavoisier has calorimeters that you have there in the slides. Priestley Nitrous-Air test or Fresnel optical diffraction experiment successfully delivered inductive inference inherent putative kinds. Now, philosophical accounts of natural kinds that I think care explaining this unreasonable projectability of long discarded kinds across history probably should play less emphasis on theories and more on the experimental technological practices that were associated with them. So this is very quickly my third and final lesson, that the projectability of natural kinds has less to do with the naturalness versus concocted nature of the predicate, green rather than grew, and more to do with the machines and instruments and experiments inspired by them and the inferences around about the range of phenomena that these experiments and experimental practices in turn license, both within and across the scientific perspectives. Now, in what follows, as I said, for reason of time, I'm just going to zoom in on one of these aspects that I mentioned, namely naturalism, with an eye to clarifying and substantiating what I simply stated as a lesson one, namely that the naturalness of natural kinds is really the result of our perspectival scientific history. So I want to start by going back to Quine himself on naturalism and try to build and expand on it, or take naturalism in a kind of slightly different direction. Thinking of natural kinds is often thinking about why a bunch of phenomena belong together, what they have in common. So consider the following two examples from botany and chemistry. The 18th century Dutch botanist, Gronovius, classified with the name Linea borealis flowers that had a distinctive Y-shaped stem and campanula-like petals, white and pink color, and whose geographic distribution ranged from the mountains of Alaska to the Dolomites. Hugo Herdman classified as noble gases, those gases with the least chemical reactivity. Now, this way of thinking about natural kinds has traditionally taken natural kinds as given, as part of nature furniture, and it has engendered a well-established metaphysical exercise of asking which properties are constitutive and defining of each given natural kinds. And usually those properties have been regarded as essential, very often macrostructural properties of the kind. So in a way, Putnam, Twin Earth thought experiment have tried against this background. But I think that this way of thinking about natural kinds tend to invert the order of things. For natural kinds are not necessarily given to us in some sort of primordial baptism of semantic nature, like the one that Putnam envisaged. If anything, natural kinds are the outcome of humankind's scientific and cultural history, of how different historically and culturally situated communities have come to historically identify them among a bewildering array of empirical regularities in nature, several of which might be candidate for natural kinds. So all natural kinds are effectively historical kinds. They are the end products of concerted generations, or efforts of generation who have successfully really identified the functionally relevant groupings in nature. But then one may ask, okay, but what counts as a relevant grouping and how do we go about identifying them? So one can imagine our Dutch botanist Gronovius going about collecting specimens of Linea borealis on his mountain trek and observing some properties, right? Like one Y-shaped stem and white flower, or another Y-shaped stem, white flower, a third Y-shaped stem, white flower, on the basis concluding the all Y-shaped stem, white flower belong to a certain kind linea. But this, of course, is a caricature, because the minimal unit of identification for natural kinds are not necessarily properties. They are too innumerable to count and too diverse to serve as reliable basis for kind classification. Is it a slightly more pinkish petal still passable as a Linea borealis? Or is it a slightly more reactive isotopic variety of argon still counting as a noble gas? I suggested that the minimal unit of classification for natural kinds are instead phenomena rather than properties. And I understand phenomena in a very specific sense. I have an entire chapter in the book, so apologies, I'm not going to go into that at the moment, but roughly stable events indexed to a particular domain that can be identified and re-identified through data to phenomena inferences across a number of scientific perspectives. So to identify flowers, one has to be able to recognize and tell apart a variety of phenomena, sometimes a phenomena about the leaves or phenomena about fruits, or how poisonous the plant is, or whether the berries might be edible, or the roots can be used for pharmaceutical purposes. Identify chemical elements similarly involve being able to tell apart a number of phenomena, such as atomic spectra, chemical reactivity, melting point, and so forth. Each of these phenomena typically occurs in different domains and fall within the remit of different epistemic communities, the chemists, the atomic physicists, the mineralogists, and so forth. So the shift from properties to phenomena as the minimal unit of classification is not moot, for it reflects really the central role that epistemic communities occupying a plurality of scientific perspectives play in the identification of natural kinds, the scientific practices they engage with, and the phenomena that they infer within those practices. We encounter kinds by identifying relevant groupings of phenomena rather than uncovering an immutable mosaic of Lewisian-like natural properties, for example. And relatedly, natural kinds are every inch of the way as historical as our scientific perspectives are. Now, just to be clear here, because I've been talking about scientific perspective, but I haven't really given you a definition of it. So the way in which I'm using the word is different from the way in which, for example, Ron Geary in his 2004 book, Scientific Perspectivism, defines it, or is also different from the way in which Sandy Mitchell defines the notion of scientific perspective, much as we share the pluralist spirit that I think is key to perspectivism. So this is what I take a scientific perspective to be. I take it to be the historically and culturally situated practice of a real scientific community at a given historical time. And I understand the notion of scientific practice to include, first of all, the body of scientific knowledge claims, they are advanced, but also the experimental, theoretical, technological resources available to reliably make those knowledge claims, and second-order methodological epistemic principles that justify the reliability of the scientific knowledge claims so advanced. So when I speak of phenomena, when I say phenomena are the minimal units of classification for natural kinds, I intend by phenomena not the sort of phenomena that, say, Pierre Duhem would defend as synonymous with appearances, but I really follow the tradition of Bogan and Woodward and their distinction between data and phenomena, in taking phenomena as the outcome of inferences from data, although in a way I part my way in characterizing data to phenomena inferences as perspectival, as embedded into a scientific perspective defined, as I just said. So scientific perspectives, as I use the term, then are not akin to Kuhn's paradigms, insulated and incommensurable with one another. They are designed to embed the social, collaborative, inferential nature of scientific knowledge. And I want to highlight very briefly a few implications for the view of natural kinds that I'm going to sketch in what follows. So first one, there are many ways of making knowledge from a plurality of historically and culturally situated scientific perspective. And therefore, scientific knowledge is always and necessarily local and situated knowledge, according to perspectival realism, knowledge originating from specific situated vantage points. Reading natural kinds through the lenses of perspectival realism means then acknowledging the historical plurality of perspectival encounter with different phenomena. And the open-ended grouping of phenomena that any natural kind that gets identified with is the reflection of these perspectival encounters, which are historically situated. And an important consequence of this historical naturalism is that the perspectival realist would not say that if one wants to know what gold is, one must ask the atomic physicist for the atomic number, or if one wants to know what a particular plant is, one must ask for the DNA sequence for it. Instead, the perspectival realist would insist that to be classified as a natural kind is to satisfy an open-ended series of historically identified phenomena. So natural kind classification is not distilling a prototype, or is not about having a historical and culturally deracinated archetype meant to be valid always and everywhere. In a way, each phenomenon is inferred from perspectival data to phenomena inferences, and such encounters are made possible in virtue of occupying historically and culturally situated perspectives. And a further important consequence of the view is therefore the central role that it gives to local knowledge of epistemic communities that, socially marginalized, have often been at the periphery of the traditional canon of scientific knowledge. So in what follow, which is my third and final part, I really want to put the notion of scientific perspective and perspectival data to phenomena inferences at work to spell out the anti-foundationalist, the Neurathian approach to natural kinds that I've simply really mentioned so far. And I shall do so really by drawing from some studies in developmental psychology, just by giving one simple example from ethnobotany to illustrate what I mean by identifying natural kinds, not through a set of essential microstructural properties, but by a group of phenomena obtained through perspectival data to phenomena inferences. So let me go back to the issue about naturalism and naturalness. So if the naturalness of natural kind is not necessarily the expression of natural joins through which nature comes prepackaged, how should one understand naturalness? Well, in the anti-foundational spirit of Neurath's book, I think the naturalism has to be historicized. The naturalness of natural kinds is to some relevant degree the result of our perspectival scientific history, rather than being downstream to some intrinsic essential microstructural properties. And let me try to explicate why I think we should historicize naturalism by starting with some brief remark from developmental psychology. Studies in developmental psychology over the past 30 years have offered really a wealth of empirical evidence as to how children learn about natural kinds from an early age via some constraints that psychologists call the whole object constraint and the taxonomic constraint. These help young children make reasonable inductive guesses about the meaning of unknown words from exposure to a single or only a few labeling examples. So Helen Markman and collaborators, for example, have studied how children aged 18 to 24 months have a preference for the word to refer to the whole object rather than parts of the objects or attributes of the objects. So when exposed with a new word like rabbit, children of that age tend to understand the word as referring to the whole object rather than rabbit's ear or rabbit's tail. And children aged 3 to 4 have a preference to generalize the meaning of the new word to taxonomically similar objects. So they tend to cluster rabbits with other animals rather than thematically, rather than clustering rabbits with carrots and barrows. The developmental advantage of doing so is clearly expressed by Helen Markman. That's what she says. She said, the assumption that categories will be structured as our natural kinds could be another early bias, one that helps children acquire category terms rapidly, organize knowledge efficiently, and induce information to novel exemplars of familiar categories. By expecting unforeseen and non-perceptual properties to be common to members of a kind, children could go beyond the original basis for grouping objects into category and discover more about the category members when they knew more. Than they knew before. Children might start out assuming that categories will have the structure of a natural kind, and with development, they would then refine this expectation, limiting them to properties, domain, and category types that are appropriate. This is end of quote from Helen Markman, 1989. In other words, the ability to identify properties as constitutive of a kind is a much later stage in developmental psychology. What comes first is the ability to associate words with the whole objects and make a presumption of natural kindhood in the early years. How to go from these early year biases towards natural kind categories to the sophisticated varieties of natural kinds to be found in the sciences is in a way what historical naturalism must shed light on. And here Darwinian considerations are only a partial explanation, because a gulf separates the kind of most basic pre-scientific classificatory abilities of children from the very complex and sophisticated taxonomy displayed in science. One thing is the Darwinian ability to find both what's common and what's different among, say, rabbits and other kinds of animals, or brown edible mushrooms and brown poisonous mushrooms. Another thing is the ability to discern the bewildering array of scientific taxa. So the rest of the explanation, I think, must come from our cultural scientific history, something that Quine naturalism didn't pay attention to. So in a way, what I'm going to be calling historical naturalism, I'm kind of coining the terminology here, is a more appropriate label to describe a kind of naturalistic, Neurath-inspired approach to natural kinds. I want to suggest that our subjective spacing of quality as a purchase on nature and alien on the future, insofar as situated epistemic communities historically learn how to classify relevant groupings of phenomena into kinds. And I want to give you a specific example from botany. Now, there's a species of flower in Mexico called the Gymnopodium floribundum that belongs to the family of buckwheat or Polygonaceae, and it's one of the most common plants in the Yucatan Peninsula. Its Mayan name is Tzitzilche. In the Kew Royal Botanical Garden herbarium, the specimen records for the plant come from Belize, and in other databases like the National Center for Biotechnology Information, the same species is classified on the basis of groups of proteins and nucleotides. And if we switch to the Biodiversity Heritage Library, we find a list of relevant bibliographic references where the role of the plant in ethnobiology is included. Now, I think it would be restrictive to think that the historical classification of this species come down to the identification of a specimen along the lines of Putnam archetype, like the one preserved at Kew Gardens, which exemplify a set of essential morphological, in this case, properties. Several concurrent perspectival phenomena have historically entered into the identification of this natural kind, known in Western botany as Gymnopodium floribundum. Some of them are phenomenological. They concern the comparative anatomy of the plant, its reproductive organ, and developments and so forth, for which herbarium specimens are a useful source of knowledge. But others concern nucleotides and protein groups inferred from the perspective of cytogenetics. Others are karyological phenomena concerning the structure of cells and chromosome. Biodiversity and ecosystem phenomena are also important. These are phenomena concerning the interrelation among living organisms in a certain environment. And to better appreciate really the perspectival nature of the inferences behind the identification of each phenomenon, let me briefly zoom in on one specific example, namely pollination. The Gymnopodium floribundum flowering season peaks between February and April, and it has traditionally played a key role in the apibotanical cycle. So rain and high temperature make the plant blossom in the spring months, and the nectar proves a vital resource for the local bee species. Hive beekeeping in specific locations continue to be an integral part of the local economy of the communities in the Yucatan Peninsula. So it is the situated knowledge of this local community about the apibotanical cycle that, for example, has the upper hand when it comes to identifying phenomena such as pollination peak. Local communities are an integral actor in this delicate biodiversity interplay. They know best how to protect their apiaries in the dry and rainy season, how to control insecticides that have devastating effects on the bees. They know when the nectar peak for the local plants so as to sustain the honey production in the ever-changing tropical season. And this is an example of perspectival knowledge about a phenomenon, let's call it PK, pollination. This situated perspectival knowledge is what enables other epistemic communities, for example, plant morphologists, to investigate other phenomena, for example, the reproductive organ of the plant and pollen production. Indeed, studies in the region of the Yucatan have found that, for example, the honey produced from this plant is underrepresented at 3% among the single flower honey of the Yucatan Peninsula, despite the plant being very, very common in the region. This finding has in turn suggested that the pollen production must be lower than that of other similar varieties of flower in the region, and an explanation for this underrepresentation might be searched for in the reproductive biology of the plant, but also in this delicate biodiverse apibotanical cycle that I mentioned above and the impact of insecticides and so forth. So in my philosophical idiolect here, the Gymnopodium taxon is all these perspectival phenomena, morphological, karyological, biodiversity, melissopanolynological phenomena, so related to the honey production, and so forth. The situated knowledge of different epistemic community makes it possible to fine-grain or coarse-grain the description of the taxon by focusing on one phenomenon rather than other. For example, plant morphologists can describe the reproductive organ of the plant, but to gain insight into the reproductive performance, one needs to fine-grain the description of the level of pollination peak. And here the local knowledge of the beekeepers and honey producer has the epistemic upper end. So under historical naturalism, the identification of relevant groupings of phenomena qua natural kinds is really humankind's collective historical and epistemic achievement. It's something that geneticists, botanists at Kew Gardens, and beekeepers in the Yucatan Peninsula equally share, and can claim as their own. And this is what historical naturalism is really ultimately about. It's a celebration of the social and cooperative nature of scientific knowledge, where a variety of perspectival situated practices by a specific epistemic community, a particular historical, geographical, and cultural location, get intertwined in delivering knowledge of natural kinds. Therefore, I think it would be a mistake to conclude that the natural kind Gymnopodium floribundum should be identified with the herbarium specimen or with the nucleotide sequence, as if this give us some privileged handle on the biological taxon. And I think it would equally be hasty to reach the opposite conclusion and defend some kind of conventionalism or nominalism about natural kind. The different epistemic practices are not an invitation to pick and choose a phenomenon instead of another, depending on specific needs. Phenomena are stable events reliably identified and re-identified through data to phenomena inferences. There's nothing conventional about either the phenomena or the groupings. And this is the realist part of the story that would deserve a paper in its own right that I cannot give today, so apologies for being short. So going back to my Neurath boat, I think the first step in this Neurathian approach to natural kind is really to acknowledge that naturalism doesn't necessarily imply metaphysically given, already carved out foundations in nature, nor is the naturalness of natural kinds the puzzling projection of our subjective spacing of qualities onto nature, following Quine. But instead, the naturalness of our kinds is really the result of our perspectival scientific history, where scientific perspective, broadly understood to include synthetic biology, no less than ethnobotany, among myriads of others, are on a journey to extend and redefine the boundaries of what we tend to think of as a natural kind. So to conclude, really my goal today was to motivate the need for an account of natural kinds that put center stage epistemic community, and especially their being historically and culturally situated, and articulating the kind of realism about science that feature such an account of natural kinds is what my forthcoming book on perspectival realism is dedicated to. And as I said, it will come out hopefully in the autumn. So until then, I want to thank you all very much once again for inviting me to give this lecture, and I very much look forward to your comments and questions.
All right, thank you very much, Michela, for this great lecture. Could you, yeah, wonderful. I was just going to ask you to get out of the presentation mode. So let me remind the audience where we're going to be working for the Q&A. If you have a question, please go to the bottom of your screen, click on the Q&A button and write your name in the text box. I will then promote you to the status of panelist, and you can ask your question directly to Michela, so that I don't have to do the translation. It takes me 1 or 2 minutes to do that, so please bear with me, and I will do that. Sandy, you're first.
Hi, Michela. It's so great to see you here. Sorry, my lighting's kind of bad.
Nice. Lovely to see you.
So I agree with so much of what you are doing. That it's always really exciting to try to push at the edges of the view to get clear about what I should think about things. So I'm not sure how much we do actually disagree about these matters, but I wanted to ask a question about calling them natural kinds itself. I mean, natural kinds is something that typically has a kind of significance that goes beyond any one of these sets of practices from which you suggest there are epistemic engagement with nature, right? So natural is it does carry with it a lot of power of defining what it really is, even if what we think it really is based on this historical cultural situatedness. And so I have this one example that it troubles me in the following sense, and I don't know what to do with it. So I'm hoping you do. And that is one of the things from your definition of the perspectivism in terms of the phenomenon, what stabilizes data to phenomena inferences across different domains, is that it really does privilege, and should it is the question, detectability or measurability. And because there's something about data going on here that's playing a specific role. So, for example, let me just put out the troubling case, because I don't want to take up all the time here. The troubling case is, for example, in the US, for various historical and cultural reasons, data on human subjects is classified into 5 racial classifications, right? And so any kind of scientific study on the effect of race on different kinds of outcomes, say different health outcomes in populations, is stratified according to these classifications, because that's how data is collected. Now, there have been challenges to understand differences in health outcomes across different individuals, not in terms of the different races, but in terms of racism, which is a structural feature of institutions like societies, of which data is very hard to collect. Okay, what do we mean by that? So there's this question about, by making the data to phenomenon inference the foundation, right, of what gets to be classified in different contexts, that there's a kind of normative privilege of what's detectable and measurable, or easily detectable or measurable, that sits now at the foundation of your notion of what's natural, right? And so the question is, are there ways in which we might want to restrict what we call this, maybe relativize the kindness to not what's natural through this, data to phenomena inference thing, but even more in a more limited way, so that what's natural doesn't have this big, powerful meaning of what's real, because it's tied to the specific ways in which data are collected. That, I don't know if that was coherent, but that's what I'm worrying about on this account.
Sure, thank you, Sandy. No, that's very helpful. So first of all, as a clarification, and kind of latching onto your last comment, natural kinds and the naturalness of natural kinds, and naturalism as the view that there are natural divisions in nature, traditionally doesn't go necessarily hand in hand with realism. So Quine is a classical example, right? So to defend the naturalism about natural kinds doesn't necessarily mean to defend any kind of strong realist view, like I think the one that you have in mind and that motivates your worry. Naturalism is some sort of kind of very basic assumptions that nature comes divided into natural divisions, where those natural divisions are real in the sense of homeostatic property cluster kinds realism, or real in the sense of there are microstructure essential properties defining them. It's kind of a separate question, and it's a question that I haven't really addressed in this paper. So what I was trying to do is just to go back to this very basic intuition that we have, that there are natural kinds, there are natural divisions, but then the question is, okay, but what makes those natural divisions? Where do they originate from? And the idea was really to develop Quine's intuition that we have some sort of subjective spacing of quality that proves to be functionally relevant. They allow us to go around nature, find our way around the world, not getting lost, and being able to survive in various. That was the Darwinian part of the story, and supplement that by saying, well, that's not enough. We need to pay attention to our cultural scientific history, because actually that's what does the heavy lifting when it comes to the identification of the phenomena via specific practices. So there is definitely the emphasis on scientific practice and the sort of things that we do with in terms of experimental, but also, very kind of daily practices that underlies in a way the idea of data to phenomena inferences. But just to mitigate some of your worries, in a way, that part of the story doesn't really carry with it any kind of strong realist normative commitment. If anything, it's very much closer to, I mentioned at the beginning, the Neurath approach, and in a way chimes with the Grünbaum, Reichenbach inspired the story of space-time. So in other words, I don't know whether I've answered your question, but by detaching the notion of realism from the notion of naturalism, and effectively I was talking about naturalism in this paper and historical naturalism, I think we are kind of creating a wedge that separates the kind of worries that I think you have from the kind of account of natural kinds that I want to defend. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but you know what I mean? Realism is some extra elements that comes associated with naturalism and the way we understand the notion of naturalism. So one may say, okay, there are natural divisions and they are underpinned by microstructural essential properties. One can say, yes, there are natural divisions and they are underpinned by homeostatic property cluster properties. But I'm not subscribing to any of those views. I'm just subscribing to the idea there are open-ended grouping of historically identified phenomena.
Okay, I'll just say one thing, but then I won't require you to answer it. And that was less about the realism, but more about the data in the data to phenomena inference that you're letting that travel across different communities. We saw that in your last example. But what counts as data itself becomes, and this is maybe just to pull up a plank on Neurath's boat and start working on that. But that's something that already encodes something. Both, it's very important for perspectivism, typically, right? Detectability and measurement. But maybe leaning into that, we would see that there were other layers of relationships between other cultural and scientific assumptions playing a role. So I will just put that out there and let someone else ask a different question.
Sure, thanks, Andy.
Thanks for joining us, Andy. Eric, the floor is yours.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for an extremely interesting and wide-ranging lecture.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask a question from the perspective of philosophy of chemistry, which is what I do. And one of the examples you gave, you talked about how different scientific communities would have different views on, let's say, the identification of an element. So you mentioned chemists, atomic spectroscopists, I think you said, and mineralogists, and so on. And of course, that's an ongoing situation. My question is, what sort of help can perspectival realism offer to questions of classification that are coming up? For instance, at the moment, there is a question as to the classification of the elements in group 3 of the periodic table. It's a long-standing debate which has reached something of a climax. The International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, UPAC, has set up a working group to have a discussion on this. And of course, they're getting advice. I happen to be chairing the group. So we're getting advice from atomic spectroscopists and mineralogists and chemists. So what can perspectival realism, what can your kind of approach offer for actually solving a problem in classification, a real life, currently existing situation?
Well, it would be wonderful, first of all, if perspectivism could offer a problem to that specific, a solution to that specific problem. I don't know whether it will, but just to give the general gist of the view that I haven't really, as I said, I mentioned scientific perspective, I gave a definition, but obviously it's not clear necessarily from this paper or the nature of perspectivism and what it does. It has to do with the kind of threefold notion of scientific perspective. So again, think of a scientific perspective, not just the body of knowledge claims, but also in terms of the practice broadly understood to include experimental practices, technological resources to reliably make those claims, and this sort of second order epistemic methodological principles that can justify the reliability of those claims. Now, that definition is inspired by a vast literature in epistemology on perspectivism that I'm drawing on. So I'm thinking of Ernst Sosa on perspectival knowledge on that. So really the idea that what perspectivism does is to provide a justification, kind of second-order justification for the reliability of knowledge claim. So having a plurality of scientific perspectives, having the different communities, different epistemic communities together, is not just to say, okay, let's all be pluralists. Yeah, of course, it's a form of pluralism, but it's a way of looking at how each epistemic community can be brought to bear on other epistemic communities to justify the reliability of their claim. So I think this is what the heavy lifting of perspectivism, the kind of heavy lifting, epistemic heavy lifting that perspectivism should do, is to clarify how this plurality of communities and situated scientific perspectives really come together in the process of knowledge production by offering justificatory principles for the reliability of knowledge claims of other communities. So it's the idea that the reliability of those knowledge claims cannot necessarily be sanctioned within one specific scientific practice, but needs other practices to come in and to cross-check the methodological principles or the epistemic norms used in producing those knowledge claims. So in the example that I was giving about the Gymnopodium floribundum, the idea is that if you really want to understand why there's a phenomenon such as a low percentage of pollen in the honey in that region coming from the plant, despite the plant being very common, you're not necessarily going to ask the biologists who study the reproductive organ of the plant, but sometimes you need actually the knowledge of the beekeepers that know the botanical cycle and how it intertwines with the bees and the honey production. So it's the ability of those different communities to bring their expertise to bear on the justification of the reliability of the knowledge claims of other communities that is important. Now, I don't know whether that applies to the specific case that you have in mind, but I have other examples in the book. For example, there's an entire chapter on the history of nuclear models, going back in the 1930s, 40s, where I try to tease out exactly how the communities of the mineralogists and the chemists and the atomic physicists had to bring their expertise to bear on each other for us to be able to identify, for example, the stability of some isotopes and other phenomena. So I hope I've answered your question.
Well, just if I may just press a little bit more.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, one committee or other, because sometimes these come down to committee decisions, have to bring all this information together. How does a knowledge of natural kinds introduced by philosophers of science help us? Or does it help us? Or does it just say, well, you'll need even more perspectives on this, which means that the poor committee members are now having to bring in other witnesses from other disciplines, if you like. And if anything, it's making the process longer and longer. If it's
well, sometimes the processes are inevitably long, but I think it depends on what the purpose of the classification is, right? So I take it that natural kinds, in a way, is a given in this exercise of asking how to classify chemical elements. So I would imagine, that there are natural kinds, or that we want to classify samples into natural kinds, in a way, is a presupposition to the very existence of this committee in question. Then the question becomes, okay, why we should go down the road of pluralism as opposed to trying to identify, atomic number as the defining microstructural features that is all that we need to know about that object, about the natural kinds. So I take it that your question is more about that. It's not so much about why we should have natural kinds, but it's more about how we should think of those natural kinds. And isn't that enough to have a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for kind membership.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much more time. Maybe we could continue in
Sure.
correspondence, because I'd love to get your further perspective on this.
Thank you very much.
If I may abuse my power as a chair, Julia had a finger on this one, so I'll give Julia, but don't abuse your finger by turning it into two hands.
No, I won't. Thank you. No, I was just, I was struck because I think, I've spent a little bit of time with Michela's view, and I actually think that there's something quite powerful that the view could give to the IUPAC question, which is the move from a property-driven classification system to a phenomena-driven classification system. And IUPAC is so property-driven, and so much of how we think about how to sort of articulate what kinds are in chemistry is so property. And to the point where, because I think about chemistry too, I'm sort of property. And it's taken a little bit of back and forth with Michela to understand how to get out of that. And once I got out of that, it gave me some new perspectives, if you will, on how to think about what classification is doing in chemistry. So I actually think that shift from properties to phenomena as the foundation, or not foundation, but the mechanism of classification could be something specific that could help with the IUPAC problem.
Thank you very much, Julia. And I mean, Julia obviously has done really important work on this, and I mean, she has a book published. She's another book that she's writing, so you can ask Julia all questions you have about the philosophy of chemistry and the classification of chemical elements, and the importance of nanotechnology for redefining the way we think about natural kinds. No, I think it is important.
So I can see an email exchange between the three of you in the coming weeks, and I would encourage you to follow up. It's a great opportunity to create some collaborations.
And same to Dick Endig, actually I saw in this list. I think she's there again. You know, her book on kinding, natural kinds as kinding and scientific practice, again, is absolutely key in this debate of how to rethink natural kinds away from traditional ways of thinking in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions or microstructural essential properties. Sorry, I'll just, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Alexei, for joining us today. And Julia, thanks for joining us as well. David, floor is yours.
Thank you. I was thinking about a particular example of yours, the classification of Pluto as a planet or not. I mean, I'm struggling to get at the pluralism in that example. I mean, it seems to have been, very, very specifically an analysis inside the particular community of people doing planetary astrophysics, that treating Pluto as a planet was distorting their picture of the distribution of bodies in the outer solar system. But at the very least, that doesn't seem to be pluralist in anything like the breadth of your examples. And I sort of suspect similar things might come out with other astrophysical classifications. I mean, astrophysicists are getting worried about whether the traditional classification of supernovae is necessarily tracking the physics as well as it should. But again, that feels like a very, very specific inside a particular community take on it. So, I mean, I don't know whether we should think that these aren't natural kinds in the relevant strong sense, or whether the pluralism is just, within a very narrow community that has sub-communities. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how you think that example plays out in your framework.
Sure. I mean, I didn't have any specific kind of substantial story to say about the Pluto example any more than the platypus one, if you like. Also in that case, one may say, well, really the people that were involved in the debate primarily were zoologists working on defining mammals. So I used that as a kind of warm-up slides to show how the way we have traditionally understood the notion of natural kinds effectively has already been challenged several times, and it's something in the news headlines as much as in the philosophical literature back to Dupré. But for example, going back to chapter 4, chapter 4a, I think at the moment is chapter 4a. So chapter 4 is split into 3 chapters. So chapter 4a in the book So it's my 3 case studies. So I have a case studies, as I said, from the history of nuclear physics around 1930s, 40s, and looking at the notion of the atomic nucleus, for example, and how we define isotopic varieties. I started doing a little bit of digging because even in that period, you may think, okay, 1930s, 40s, we are in the heydays of the kind of quantum theory, and obviously the people that were involved in these debates, from von Weizsäcker to Gottfried Meyer to Bohr, and I mean, they're all physicists, right? The moment you start actually doing some historical research, you discover that behind the history of nuclear models in that period, there was actually the work of petrologists that started studying the percentages of chemical elements in rocks in particular regions of the world. And then you study that there are people working in cosmochemistry, so people that were interested in meteorites, and again, the percentages of different elements in meteorites, and asking themselves the question as to whether the abundance is observed in meteorites and the abundance is observed in the Naples region, for example, the volcanic region around Naples and the Vesuvius had some relation to one another. So it's something that I reconstruct in that chapter. And this is just to say that sometimes, we get this very kind of chronologically necessarily short snapshot of how a scientific field works, and especially in contemporary science, I think that's often the case. But as soon as we dig a little bit more into the history, and that's why it's historical naturalism, you discover that actually there is a lineage that really includes a plurality of epistemic communities that we have long forgotten. So no one remembers today the work of the petrologists at the start of the last century. They actually prompted some of this work on isotopic abundances, and in a way acted as a trigger for models of the nucleus that could answer the problem about isotopic abundances. So long answer to your question. Pluralism is there. It's just a matter of digging a little bit back in time into our scientific history, I think.
I guess I could say extremely plausible that's true for an enormously wide range of examples. I could perfectly well believe it, in fact, turns out to be true for the classification of planets. I could even believe it happens to be true for the classification of type 2 supernovae. I'm worried that we can't know a priori it has to be true. I mean, it's relatively, in hindsight, it's relatively unsurprising that something like the classification of nuclei is going to be something a lot of people have to play in, because there are lots of nuclei and they're all over the place, and lots and lots of different sciences are having a go at that stuff through lots of different tools. There's a lot in our current historical situation, in our current technological state. We're just in a position to probe nuclei of atoms in lots and lots and lots of different ways. It's less obvious that we're in a position to probe the exotica of astrophysics, which many of whom haven't discovered that for that long, and which tend to require extremely narrow modalities of observation to get at them. And again, that's contingent. Sure, if we were, if we had a galaxy spanning civilization and supernovae were relevant to various issues of interstellar history and things, and then of course and if we cared about the effects of supernovae on life forms in the vicinity and so on, then it could be pluralist. But it doesn't seem that it logically has to be pluralist in those sort of particular cases.
Right. Well, I mean, as I said, in particular cases, I can't really speak to those cases, but it's not meant to be some sort of a priori truth that there has to be this sort of endemic perspectival pluralism. It's more a reflection on how science very often has worked in relevant areas. And
I find it very persuasive. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
All right, thanks, David. Paulo Abuentes, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Michela, for this wonderful.
Can you get? Hold on. Can you speak up a little bit? We can barely hear you.
Yeah, my computer doesn't work very well. I know that there is a problem with the mic. Are you listening to me? Okay.
Yes.
Michela, thank you very much for your very stimulating talk. My question, I don't know if it is a question or a comment, comes from my work or my interest in the philosophy of biology. So it changes a little bit from physics, chemistry to biology. And your talk has a lot to do with biology. Well, I think you mentioned Quine, the role of natural selection, and at certain points you talked about genes, etc. And the way you refer to the work, with children, and the way children develop, and how they are helped to get some notions of natural kinds. That made me think about the role played, for instance, in some discussions in the philosophy of biology, of niche construction, the greater and greater role that is attributed to development, and all this criticism of the genocentric reductionist view of the units of selection. And of course, the role culture plays in many species, but certainly in the human and development of humans. And so my question is very general, is if you think that these discussions in the philosophy of biology that brings actually the individual mind back to the center of the discussion, even if you have all these concerns about culture, the role culture plays in the development of individual minds, etc., and also all these discussions on the levels of selection, the role of selection at the group level, etc. Do you think, I don't know if you talk about that in your book, I am very curious about that, but do you think these debates in the philosophy of biology could have an importance for your kind of perspectival realism? Or do you think that these discussions in philosophy of biology don't have necessarily or directly an implication for debates in the general philosophy of science about natural kinds? What's your opinion about that?
Sure, thanks. No, I think they do play an important role on ongoing debates on natural kinds. It's just I may not be the best person to answer the specific question of in what ways, because partially I'm not a philosopher of biology, and so the specific example that you were referring to are not really example that I've been looking at in the book. I mean, there are people in this list of in this audience, from Sandy to Kitty Kending and others, that can answer your question better than I can hope to do. I think, if I understood your question correctly, the idea that there are different domains of inquiry and there are kind of domain-specific phenomena, as I was trying to suggest, in a way is a key component of the view of natural kinds that I want to defend, the idea that really natural kinds are nothing over and above this open-ended grouping of historically identified phenomena. So I would imagine that the debates in philosophy of biology that you were referring to, in a way, debates about the impossibility of singling out one element of biological organization as the privileged element or level, obviously are very much congenial to the analysis of natural kinds that I ultimately want to defend. But as I said, it's something that actually I don't go into the book, and it's just because of ignorance. I'm not a philosopher of biology. But there are people in this group that I'm sure can articulate a more informed answer to your really interesting question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo Puentes, for joining us today. Neda, floor is yours.
Hi, Michela. Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm thinking through related ideas through my dissertation on this topic. So it was really fun to hear this, and I'm really looking forward to your book and diving into those arguments. So my question isn't necessarily about what you've talked about here, but it's more on, I guess, it's inviting you to speculate on some of the social dimensions of these ideas. So I'm teaching a class right now called Science and Pseudoscience. And one thing I'm finding from my student reflections and discussions is just how comforting it is to believe in the view from nowhere. And it gives like a kind of authority to science that, takes away the burden on us, whether that's psychologically or resource-wise, to not have to delve into all those like historical, cultural details and details about scientific knowledge production. So while I try to, push my students to think about how knowledge is produced, and to move away from this ahistorical approach, I'm finding that overwhelms them. And so this is something that I just wanted to invite you to think about, because I know that the realist view, that view from nowhere, is tied to a unity of science view that is comforting. And I know that it can be harmful. There are a lot of kindred spirits in this audience who know what those harms are. But the teaching experience has also kind of pushed me to challenge myself and thinking that there can also be some positive dimensions to it socially, especially during the current climate on how we're treating science and thinking about it and questioning it as an authority. So anyway, I thought that maybe you could say something about this. This is not necessarily a philosophical question, but something that just through thinking about the social effects of furthering these views, how you're handling them. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, it is a very philosophical question. I guess I think you're right that in a way the view from nowhere is lurking behind also this debate on realism, natural kinds, because it provides that comforting ground of unanimity. So one of the functions that I mentioned at the beginning, why do we care about natural kinds? Why do we still have debates about natural kinds? And I take it that one of the reasons for it is because we care about unanimity. We care about being able to reach a common ground on a given topic. So we may disagree about the percentages of deuterium oxide in different oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, and insofar as deuterium oxide is a kind of water and is classified as a isotopic variety of water, this is what we need to reach scientific consensus. What I try to do, I guess, in the book is to tell a story about realism that doesn't start with the assumption of a view from nowhere, but in a way is still meant to deliver on realism, but as a result of, if you like, our perspectival history, how we have come to develop the reliable knowledge that we have developed thanks to a plurality of situated perspectives. And I think that's comforting enough. And I think that should be comforting enough for the realist. I don't think we need any extra rock solid metaphysical first foundation level to provide us with that level of scientific comfort in why is it that we agree, and why is it that we have such a successful science, why we have produced reliable knowledge over time. I think the answer to this question lies in plurality and pluralism of perspectives. So I don't see, I don't see the two in opposition to one another. If anything, I want to tell a story of that kind of unanimity from within rather than from above, from within our scientific history and the plurality of perspectives rather than from first foundation. I hope I've answered your question. But yeah, I try to recoup that kind of scientific comfort in the idea that, of course, we should be realist about science, but the realism doesn't require necessarily metaphysical foundations.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Nida, for joining us today. Siddharth, floor is yours.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
So first, let me just preface that because of something that came up, I briefly had to miss portions of your talk. So if you covered it there, if you covered my question there, apologies. So my question has to do with perhaps the sciences that are more mathematical. And the question is, wouldn't you get a somewhat less perspectival notion of kinds that aren't so contingent on historical patterns of identification and not as open-ended if you think of the classification as coming out of just mathematical constraints and theorems? So just a very simple example, if you think of something like the orbits around a star of planets, then we know for attractive forces, the orbits can only be conical sections like ellipses, hyperbolas, or parabolas. And if we want closed stable orbits, then they have to be elliptical. So in a way, we already know that just by that mathematical theorem, we have a classification of the kinds of orbits there can be, which seems to be a pretty good candidate for what kinds of things we're talking about in natural kinds. Other examples could be in the classification of spin using irreducible representations in quantum mechanics. You can sort of come up with many examples in physics where, you know, just mathematical theorems tell you what kinds of entities can or cannot exist. And that way of identifying doesn't seem to be as historically contingent or open-ended. So do you think that's a better candidate for natural kinds than some of these other? So how does that fit with your framework? I should ask that rather. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you. It's an important question, and I don't have really an answer to your question, because if I understood the question, the idea is that there is something about mathematics, and in particular the role of mathematics in specific domains in the physical sciences, that sets it apart from other fields that are more kind of experimental or more open, vulnerable to the tribunal of experience in a way. And it's not really something that I addressed in the book, and it's not really something that I confess I've thought about, but which is probably shame on me, I should have thought about it. I guess I have a strong intuition, and maybe this is I don't know, it's probably the HPS person in me that, you know, even when we talk about things like the orbits of a planet, we're not talking about atemporal, historically deracinated objects. We're talking about things that, you know, the Babylonians, as much as the Greek astronomer, thought about. And they had their models, they had their views. So in a way, I guess I don't tend to think of natural kinds, even in this sense of, I don't know, the orbits of, I don't know whether orbits of a planet count as natural kinds. But anyway, what is a planet, for example, in a way that is that can be set apart from the history, and that we can treat as the object of a specific domain of inquiry, be it mathematical physics or whatever, regardless of the historical contingency. I mean, those things, like exactly what a planet is as a history of its own, and the term planet meant originally wanderer, and there's all this debate that, you know, go back to Kuhn about, okay, how the term again changed the meaning before and after Copernicus. So I guess I come from that tradition, so I tend to see that debate in that light, rather than okay, here is a set of mathematical theorems that tell us that there can only be, you know, those kinds of orbits and so forth. So it's a way of recovering the past and recognizing that, you know, our past fellows had their own views about those objects, and they classify them in a particular way, and try to do justice to their historicity in a way, in the way we think about kinds. So I realize this is not the answer that you were hoping for, but just to explain, the way I've been approaching the issue, coming from kind of HPS.
Yeah, so this is something that I haven't really thought about. Is so you can prove mathematical theorems, but the theorems are making implicit assumptions about what the terms in the theorems are referring to. And if I understand you correctly, that those terms, what they're referring to, can't be fixed without historical patterns of talking about phenomena, right? And
yeah, that's right. So the natural kind terms, be they planet in this case, or I don't know, orbits, are the reference of those natural kind terms is not given by theorem. It's given by a class of entities that were classified as such, and historically happened that different communities had different classes of things that they counted as a planet, or they counted as water, or they counted as a platypus, or they counted as a mammal, and so forth. So it's kind of that's exactly the background to the story. So how do we think about natural kind terms and the reference of natural kind terms, taking into account those historical contingencies? So it's really coming from the Kuhnian tradition, which I mentioned in one of the slides at the beginning.
Edward, can I do a quick follow-up, or is that?
No, you can. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess the remaining puzzle then for me would be that the sort of applicability and success of fairly sophisticated bits of mathematics in physics somehow, at least this is not an argument, but just a puzzle perhaps, that there seems to be some kind of disconnect between the terms being very historically contingent, or perhaps historically mediated. Maybe you don't like the word contingent, and then there being these very precise and clear theorems that you can say about them. So in a way, there's a kind of let's say presupposition of a kind of imprecision that comes along with the historical aspect of this, that seems to be at least somewhat in tension with the precision and clarity offered by the mathematical theories available here.
Yeah, so I don't know whether this might help as an answer to your question, but and it's not really an answer to your question, but for example, in the book, I discuss how I see perspectivism to bear on the debate on laws of nature. Laws of nature play a big role in the discussion that I have in the book about how to understand the notion of phenomena, how to understand in a way the reality of those phenomena inferred from the data. And the view that I suggest there is some kind of best system analysis a la Lewis, where effectively axioms or theorems of our best theories are the laws of nature are the axioms or theorems of our best systems. But I understand this best system analysis as perspectival itself. So I don't think that, we have a system that counts as the best system in terms of achieving the best balance of simplicity and strength, which is fixed once and for all. For obvious reason, again, for the reason that, caloric had its own laws at the time of Lavoisier and does it have it now, for obvious reason that people in the past believed in sets of things that we don't recognize as part of our best system today. So in a way, I see, if you like, laws of nature as part of a perspectival best system, a series of best systems. They are themselves historically situated. So in a way, I don't see much of a tension, but just because I'm happy to probably do something very unorthodox, which is to put those laws of nature on wheels as much as anything else. So I guess it's the price to pay for the view. But
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. Roosevelt Lai or Lei? I'm sorry, I might butcher your name.
Hello, my name is Roosevelt. I'm a third-year student at Beloit College, but I will be joining a U Pittsburgh philosophy of science summer seminar.
Wonderful to join us today. I'm delighted to meet you in advance. Thank you.
Merci. So I'm going to say something that resonates in my mind about what you talk about perspectivism, because I think I have a wide range of background in philosophy, ranging from phenomenology to cognitive science, embodied mind, extended mind. I think Andy Clark used to teach in University of Edinburgh.
Yeah. That's right.
Our college speak way back about natural. I mean, what do you call it? The cyborg. I mean, natural. I mean, he talked about the extended mind theory, and I think in light of my background, I think what I'm hearing is this shift from understanding natural kind as a kind of entity we must commit to because you're rejecting the so-called foundationalist, essentialist approach of the natural kind. And you talk about, when we talk about natural kinds, we talk about those things, we sort of commit ourselves to prescribe the kind of ultimate entity of the reality as such. I think that has to do with the tendency of I'm curious, the tendency of the evolution, the theory of evolution, that it tends to give you this, what I call a credulity of prescribing the things as universal, prescribe the thing as absolute applicable. And I think what I'm hearing is that you want to open up this understanding that when we talk about natural kind, what are we committing to believe in, okay? And you want to offer, you want to step back a little bit to think about, okay. And I think one approach that I can think of is, a few months ago, I read George Lakoff, The Metaphors We Live By, and the approach of so I call metaphor school of philosophy of language. They reject the talk of natural kind. They say, it's just a messy ground. Let's not even go there, And I think Daniel Dennett, he always talk about the kind of intuition pump, because he really reject the Cartesian dualism. It might sound very irrelevant, but I think the relevancy here is that Daniel Dennett and George Lakoff try to remind us there are ways that we talk about things, presuppose the kind of questions that we committed to. And I bring George Lakoff, The Metaphors We Live By. I'm wondering if natural kinds are some of those metaphors that we set up for observing the relations that we have with those things that we are describing. And in describing, we are prescribing a very special kind of relation with them. Because what do metaphors do to us is that we are saying something and we're describing our relation to them. And in this relation that we have with entities or objects, right, or in embodied-mind theories, embedded in this context of equipping some tools and mind, we find ourselves as human as such, or the plants being recognized as such in relation to ours. So I'm wondering if that is somewhat relevant to your studies, because I think one is that understanding those so-called natural kind are not the final explanation per se, that it's an ultimate entity out there. We can reclassify, reevaluate what we are talking about, those natural kinds, and evaluating the relations that we have with them, and understanding what I call credulity, like what we are committed to believe in describing those natural kinds as such, right? And I think that's the way I'm thinking while listening to your lectures. And I also appreciate the previous questionnaire talk about the social construction of race and how the data were collected towards that. I think a part of that is because, I'm thinking, how does it relate to your study? I think it's that the perspective that we generate through those entities. The doctor mentioned about the social entity, that the race, the different category, that gravitate us to contribute so-called natural kind or social kind towards that direction. So I think in this tension right there, I like to introduce the elements of the metaphor in the philosophy of language to let us think about what is the relation. What is the relation that we're committing to believe, the relation between us as a subject and the prescription of the subject and the object in our language, in our use of the language, right? And those metaphors, natural entities, different kinds, can be family resemblance. In Wittgenstein's sense, that it doesn't have to be as, so pluralistic can be secure. Okay,
Yeah, let me intervene a little bit, and let's give Michela an opportunity to comment or respond to this question.
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. It's a very kind of complex question. So I guess in reply, I would say, so definitely the idea that I would like to defend about natural kinds is this idea that natural kinds, yes, don't have any first foundations. They are not identifiable by sets of microstructural essential properties. But in a way, yes, there are relations between different phenomena that we tend to identify natural kind with. And I haven't really said anything about that part of the book. I mean, that's a separate chapter. So how do I think of those relations between those phenomena? So I was simply giving the highlights. Okay, this is the view. So I think as well that that the series of historically identified phenomena is very much open-ended. So it's subject to changes over time, and it's also subject to additions over time, and so forth. At the same time, I think the view is not a conventionalist view in the sense that I don't think that natural kinds are just nominal labels that we attach to an open-ended grouping of phenomena. I think that there are specific reasons as to why some phenomena belong together and others don't. And I think that those reasons have to do in part with the law-likeness that is inherent in the notion of phenomena, again, something that I haven't really discussed in today's talk, but also has to do with how epistemic communities in a way negotiate the use of natural kind terms to refer to some phenomena rather than others. So there is definitely an emphasis placed on human agents and human communities in that decision making, but it's not the kind of emphasis that is one and the same with sheer conventionalism, because it's grounded in reliable scientific practices and a robust method for identifying and re-identifying the phenomena, but also is grounded in well-established practices of how we negotiate which phenomena go together or which phenomena don't go together. So that is something I discuss in a different chapter of the book, which I haven't obviously covered today. But I hope it gives an answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us today, and looking forward to have more occasion to talk in the coming months at the Pittsburgh summer program. I'm delighted. I think that's about it for the question for today. It's been a long Q&A. So thank you very much for bearing with us. Thanks to the attendants and the Q&A participants for joining us for this wonderful lecture and exchange for the 2021 Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecture.